Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza. We're absolutely thrilled, excited to welcome the Nasher Sculpture Center and our neighbors and family. So I want to thank the Nashers, the family, for selecting the 6th floor museum as a venue for this very important conversation about how history inspires creation of art and sculpture. And I know tonight is going to be an absolutely dynamic conversation, but we're thrilled to partner with Jeremy and all your wonderful staff. And before passing over the podium to you, I'd like to just read a quote from President Kennedy that he made at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in 1962. Above all, we are coming to understand that the arts incarnate the creativity of a free people. When the creative impulse cannot flourish, when it cannot freely select its methods and objects, when it is deprived of spontaneity, then society severs the root of art. And I think that's very poignant for the conversation that we're about to have tonight, especially given the location of this event. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy Strick, and enormous thanks to the National Sculpture Center.
Nicola, thanks so much, and good evening. We're really delighted to present this Nasher Prize Dialogues conversation tonight in partnership with our friends here at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, who've kindly offered this space in this important Dallas landmark to bring you this discussion, Nasher Prize Dialogues, Sculpture plus History. In the spirit of the Nasher Sculpture Center's mission to provide an international focal point and catalyst for the study and appreciation of modern and contemporary sculpture, in April 2015, the Nasher Prize was inaugurated, the most significant award in the world dedicated exclusively to contemporary sculpture. It is presented annually to a living artist who has had an extraordinary impact on the understanding of the art form. Each winner is chosen by a jury of renowned artists, museum directors, curators, and art historians who have an expertise in the field and varying perspectives on the subject, and each winner receives a $100,000 prize conferred in April of each year. Our inaugural laureate was Colombian artist Doris Salcedo, and last year's was French artist Pierre Huyghe. This year, we celebrate the remarkable American artist Theaster Gates, to whom we will dedicate the next month at the museum, offering free programs and educational activities so that Dallas and its visitors can get to know the work of this dynamic and important artist. Complementing the Nasher Prize is a series of public programs called Nasher Prize Dialogues, of which this discussion tonight is a part. These panel discussions, lectures, and symposia, made in partnership with other institutions around the world, such as the Akademie der Kunst Berlin, the Institute of Contemporary Arts London, and Museo Jumex, Mexico City, are intended to foster international awareness of sculpture and to stimulate new scholarship, discussion, and debate by offering engagement with various audiences and providing myriad perspectives into the ever-expanding field of sculpture. Future dialogues, conversations will take place in May in Glasgow as part of Glasgow International in partnership with the Common Guild, and in August in Reykjavik, Iceland, in partnership with the Reykjavik Art Museum. Tonight, we extend hearty thanks to the 6th Floor Museum for partnering with and hosting us, with a special thanks to director Nicola Longford and her team for their help in organizing this event. Our thanks also goes to the Donna Wilhelm Family Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts for their generous support of the educational and public programs that are part of Nasher Prize Month, as well as to ESOP for their thoughtful contributions to these programs. Thanks also to our local Nasher Prize media partners, the Bilo Group and KERA Art and Seek, and to this evening's national media partner, Cultured Magazine. I also want to acknowledge and thank our Nasher Prize co-chairs for 2018, Kristen and Derek Wilson. The talk is being live-streamed via Facebook on the Nasher and Cultured Facebook pages, and we encourage those watching to participate in the conversation both on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag Nasher Dialogues. Our conversation tonight will explore the ways in which current artistic practice looks to history and history's documents to create work in a variety of sculptural forms, from the monumental to public intervention to video. All of the work by our panel of artists looks deeply at the past in order to ask our present moment difficult and pressing questions, and we look forward to delving into these ideas. The talk will be moderated by Ben Davis, National Art Critic for Artnet News and author of the book 9.5 Theses on Art and Class, published in 2013, which explores the complicated intersections of commerce and art, and which the New York Times said conveys Mr. Davis's faith in art as an agent of transformation, a quality which is certainly relevant to our conversation tonight. Mr. Davis was formerly executive editor of artinfo.com and an editor of the Elements of Architecture, the catalog of the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale. His writings have appeared in Adbusters, the Brooklyn Rail, eFlux Journal, Freeze, New York Magazine, the New York Times, Slate.com, The Village Voice, among others. We are thrilled that Ben Davis is here to lead this dialogue with our truly remarkable panelists, artists Alfredo Jaar, Paul Ramirez Jonas, Jill Magid, and Dallas's very own Lauren Woods. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, I guess while our great panelists take the stage, I'll just say a few words. I'll grab the podium and say a few words. It's a real charge. I'm Ben Davis, I should say. It's a real charge to be here. Thank you. It's so exciting for, I think, all of us to be down here from temperate New York, from cold New York to temperate Dallas, although it's not totally clear that the airplanes are going to let us go back. So you guys are in luck. You have us for a while. I just wanted to say here at the beginning how I'm thinking about this conversation, which is that from the moment that the Nasher asked me to do this, I looked at the people on this panel and I thought to myself, this discussion is too important to be left to the artists themselves. And by that I mean this, is that I don't know how many artist panels you've been to, but I've been to a couple. And most of the time it ends up being actually a series of presentations with not a lot of discussion. But I think that these four people have really important things to say about what it means to make art at this particular historical moment, and that it's a rare opportunity to be able to have them all together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and tease out, and after all, you do have their biographies right here in your program, and they're all pretty well-known types in any case. So what I'm going to try and do is introduce them myself, put my own gloss on their work, and get them to talk a little bit about why they do what they do. And then we'll talk a little bit about the bigger issues that loom over this conversation, which is about documentary and monument and the use of documents. And then you will have the chance at the end to weigh in. You should all have on your seats, you have these cards and you should have little pencils. So don't be shy. You know, if you have something to ask, something that bothers you, please write it down and we will try and take it up. So without further ado, I'm going to get the conversation kicked off. Which is, so, like I said, I don't want this to become an extended series of introductions. I think that we should get down to the meat of the conversation, but I do think that we are talking about visual art, and so I want to have some visual references. So I asked each of the artists to send me 2 to 4 artworks that they thought were relevant to the conversation that they wanted to have, and I put them together into this into this presentation. So I'm going to do what art critics do, which is, after all, reduce very complex and nuanced works to two-line summaries, by way of introducing each of these figures, going alphabetically, and then ask them briefly to talk about their practice more generally, and we'll get into the conversation. So the work you're looking at now is by Alfredo Jaar, the man sitting to the immediate left of me. This is a very famous work called 1 Million Finished Passports from 1995, which is a representation of exactly what the title says. It was replying to the extremely restrictive immigration policies in Finland at the time. So it was visualizing what it would look like, the number of people who were denied entry to the country, finding a visual metaphor for that theme at that time, which now seems more prescient than ever. This is a second work by Jaar called the Skoghall Kunsthall, which took place, intervention that took place in a old paper mill town in Sweden. And he endeavored to create a new event space made out of paper, where people could put on creative actions to kind of rejuvenate, give a new cultural life to Skoghall. And then after a very short period of time, it was burned symbolically. This is the Geometry of Conscience, which is a memorial to the victims of the US-backed Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, where what you're looking at here is a series of silhouettes of various people, real people, who were victims of the violence and terror of those years. And people descend into the area, and the illuminated figures come at them, and then after a short period of time, they're plunged back into the darkness. It's a different kind of idea of a memorial than some you might be familiar with. And finally, this is the Nasher's own music. Everything I know, I learned the day my son was born, which I'm sure many of you have experienced it. It's a space you go into, and it has recordings of different infants born in Dallas over a certain time period, whose cries are timed to appear at exactly the moment that they, more or less, that they came into the world. So it's kind of a symphony of new beginnings. So Alfredo, it's a very diverse collection of things. So I just wanted to ask you, what ties them all together? What is it? Why do you're working in an experimental kind of way with documents, in semi-public types of work. What to you brings it all together?
I never studied art. I'm an architect, that makes sense.
Yeah, there we go.
I never studied art, and I'm an architect who makes art. And for an architect, context is everything. So basically, I respond to a given context, and I react. And the motto I've used all my career has always been the same. Before acting in the world, I need to understand the world. So basically, when I'm invited to design a memorial, to create a public intervention in a city, or to respond to the Nasher's anniversary, I react based on my investigation, on my research of the place. And so I will not act before understanding, and I will not act before comprehending the totality of the space and coming up with ideas that respond to that space. And I do that as an architect.
That's perfect. That's exactly that gives us a perfect starting point. And with that, I will move on to Paul Ramirez Jonas, the man third to my left. So this is Public Trust, a work that was recently performed in Boston. I understand is moving on to Mexico City.
What time is it now?
It is 7:21.
Yeah, they're just shutting down for the day in Mexico City.
Well, you heard it here first, or you heard it here early. But in any case, this is a artwork that's about the idea of the promise, that people are asked to make a promise in public and swear that promise with whatever kind of way that they think is effective, on the Bible or the Quran or on the Constitution, whatever ratifies it in their way. And then those promises are collected and put onto this public board and combined with various other promises harvested from the media. So promises politicians, companies, and so on are making. It's really a work about the language of promises, what it means to make a promise, and how important the idea of trust and promises are, and broken promises are in our public sphere. This is a work called Literatura Gris, which grows out of a longer project, I believe. And people were given the opportunity to have a piece of history that they wanted written down by people, transcribed. And then that material was gathered together into books, and those books were eventually entered into the archives, important archives in Honduras and in the United States. So sort of a way to symbolically enter the people's voice, give the people entry, their voice a space of entry into the official public sphere. And finally, this is Alternative Facts, just from last year. I believe this is at the New Museum. And where people who had a lie that they wanted to be taken as the truth, there was a notary on hand. You could tell any kind of lie, and they would certify it as the truth for you if you wanted to get away with it. And those were displayed. And then to sort of symbolize this, the idea of the coin of fake news or alternative facts circulating in the public, people had to pay with pocket change. That there was a device on hand that could electroplate your normal pocket change into gold coins. So a work about all very common themes about the way language functions and circulates in the public sphere. What ties it all together for you? What do you do? Who are you?
I think for a long time I made work that was just with pre-existing histories, usually that were forgotten, and then that slowly morphed into the history that people can tell, and I rely a lot on language and voice and what can people contribute. So I always think of the viewer first, that I'm making work for the viewer, and that I want it to be an exchange. So I almost retro-engineer it now to like, what do you all have on you right now that you could give me in exchange for something else? You could tell me a lie, you could tell me a promise, you could give me spare change, you could let me copy a key from your keychain, you could give me a handshake. So I just go through like, what do you all have when you go into an exhibition space or on the street that you can use as an exchange to get something else back? So I think that's what's really tying the work together, is that to create these exchanges with what you already have and then eke out the social contracts that are inherent in those exchanges.
Excellent. Okay, well, moving right along, then our alphabetically third panelist is the woman at the end, Jill Magid, who I think, I could be wrong, but I believe this may have been star-making work for Jill. This is the Spy Project, where she was asked by the Dutch intelligence services to do a work of art. This is part of it's the Netherlands. There's a robust mandates for public art. So they were asked to do this work of art about public art, semi-public art for the Dutch intelligence services. And what she did is she went and interviewed a variety of people who'd worked for them, and eventually turned that into a kind of series of artworks about what really goes on at a Dutch intelligence agency, and it was displayed in these forms of redacted documents, and became a real fuss. I believe that they even came and famously confiscated it from, it was shown at the Tate. And the material was eventually, and there are all kinds of other legal shenanigans that Jill can talk about later, and I believe it was eventually collected into this book, Becoming Tartan, that was released in 2010. And the second, that's a ruthlessly simplified version of a very complex conceptual project. And the second work that she wanted to talk about was this, the Barragan Archives, which is an ongoing archive project. I actually don't know if it's still ongoing or if it's officially the period, you put a period on it. But that is dedicated to the Mexican architect Luis Barragan, who's a famous figure of Mexican modernism, who's underknown because the archives of his work are very tightly controlled, that they're owned by family woman in Switzerland, and who very tightly regulate the circulation of the material. So Jill saw that limitation and dove right into trying to press those buttons and created this ongoing fluid project which would figure out ways to like tell his story, what kind of material could be contextualized as art to circulate the legend and life of Luis Barragan. That became a whole dialogue with the people who control and own the collection, a long-running series of installations that expand and dilate this theme, and eventually sort of came to a symbolic climax when she actually managed to get the folks connected with the Barragan estate in Mexico City to exhume part of his body and transform it into a diamond that was set in an engagement ring, which was then offered as to attempt to get, symbolically attempt to get the people who own the archives in order to open them up to the world. So very complex stuff. Jill, tell us about what you do.
So I would say what ties them all together is that I'm really interested in how structures of society work, and my first many years of my practice were really about government systems mainly, and so a lot of surveillance and CCTV, and that kind of organically led to then getting this commission by the Dutch intelligence agency, and really trying to understand like systems that are closed to citizens, to the general public, but yet we pay for them and they're part of our society. How can I engage with them, and I as a tool of anyone else? Like, how can I create a dialogue with closed systems of power? And how can power become more fluid by one's participation into it? And the Barragan Archives project was really the first time that investigation led to a corporate control as opposed to government control, but then I learned that governments are kind of mixed into corporate control. So these are the themes, really, of trying to figure out access and power, and doing it through ways that are kind of romantic and very human and intimate ways of entering in to understand how that participation can play out.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least is Dallas's own Lauren Wood. Any Lauren Wood fans in the house? That's what I thought. So this is Portrait of the African Shore. Ongoing work started in 2008 that is this video montage or collage of different images of the African shore taken from nature documentaries and various forms of Hollywood, which really shows the common language that's been developed to like represent those spaces, to develop the image that we have of Africa, and what a kind of limited vocabulary it is with its own kind of quirks and fixations. This is a Dallas drinking fountain project that I'm sure most people here in this room are familiar with, but I'll explain it anyways, which is that it is, they discovered a remnant of segregation in this whites-only drinking fountain. They were trying to figure out what to do with this. This is very controversial, and Lauren managed to insert herself into this conversation and turn this into a public work of art where people who want a drink of water have to wait through a 15-minute video about the history of the struggle for African-American civil rights in order to do so. And it has drawn very wide interest. Up in the top right there is the great intellectual and activist Cornel West visiting Dallas and stopping for a drink. And then the last, this is Lauren speaking at the Dallas Parks Board in 2016 as part of her effort called the Dallas Historic Parks Project, which is a part of a larger discussion about re-examining how we tell the history of the spaces that we live in the times we live in, where artists, Lauren and another artist, I believe, Cynthia Mulcahy, have been working together to investigate this and look at alternate ways to tell the history of the formerly black parks in Dallas and tell that story fully in a monumental form. And this, as I understand it, has been quite controversial, remains so, which probably means you're doing something right?
Yeah.
And has drawn quite a bit of media attention here and nationally. And this is the press photo from the Dallas Morning News, where in the story that first talked about the struggles you had in realizing it. So tell me about some of those threads are obvious and some of them are less.
What ties it all together? The need to stay insane, or sane. I was going to say insane. The need, which is part of it. Yeah, I'm keeping myself insane. No, the need to stay sane. I mean, I think it's very personal. What ties all the work together. You know, performing the act of witnessing, as James Baldwin says, and materializing it, trying to, you know, make sense and produce text from, you know, the lineage I'm from, which is, you know, people like me who have come from a lineage of like being below subject. So, you know, having the ability to now speak about these things, it's, you know, sort of a almost duty bred into me. So.
Great. Well, on the duty of speaking, we can begin the official conversation then. And if the folks we can just begin circulating the images if you care to. So here's what I really want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the duty of storytelling in this particular moment. And I guess I'll go back to the title of your work, Alternative Facts, Paul, because I feel like specifically in the last year and a half, since the election and all the angst and conversation that came out of that, and before, there's been a lot of talk and soul searching and about the idea of truth and this concept that we live in a post-truth world. For the longest time, the idea of questioning the truth, the facts, the master narratives was considered to be the cutting-edge artistic thing to do. To ask questions about the institutions that we work in and the structure of power we embedded and undercut people's authority and natural attachment to them and make people see them. And I feel like there's been a shift in the way people talk about that since this idea of kind of creating alternative histories and sort of confusing things, and people asking themselves, were we just undermining the sense of public trust in stable institutions and the authority of facts? And were we somehow party to making the kind of splintering of the public sphere that we experience today? What do you have you're the one who has been playing with alternative facts. What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's interesting because things are moving really quickly in our society, in our relationship to truth, but it's been a long time coming. It's interesting that this panel is about archive and everything, and as you were doing the presentations, I kept thinking, oh, I'm interested in primary sources, right? And the primary sources means people, right? It's just either someone recorded their history or you're interacting with someone, and that's the primary source. My work is very empirical. I just sort of tend to do it in public places with people. And the first alternative facts was actually called fe publica, public trust. And I did in Argentina. And it was people could tell lies and I would turn them into truths. And in Latin America, different countries that live with dictatorships or repression, you have a way of speaking where you want to say something political, you can couch it as a joke or as a this, so you always have the disclaimer that I really didn't say that. Mm-hmm. So when I did in Argentina, it was great because people would say, my lies, Argentina's great, or I love the president, or so it was either really, people were using it for political.
So it gave them a chance to actually.
If I say this, I mean the reverse. Or very personal.
Kind of frame official lies.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Or they would say things like, I love my mother. That would be very painful, So there was a shift between the super personal and the super political. Then I did it in the States, and it was just very playful. This was 3 years ago. So I was like, you know, it's too playful. There's no consequence. But I thought everything we say is either on its way to becoming a truth or a lie. And then I started to think of promises as being in this space. When we make a promise, like, I'll see you tomorrow, that might be a lie or a truth. We'll see tomorrow. So then I'm going to shift the piece to make promises. And then what became in Boston was super earnest.
The public spaces.
Yeah, and I would do it on the street, and I would call promises from the media, from public figures, so people who can speak in public and have their promises broadcast, right? So it would be like VW and Trump and Clinton, and it was timed right before the election. And people's promises in relation to these things that were happening in the media seemed so trustworthy. And everything around them seemed, people would smirk when they would read these headlines. I would be calling every 24 hours.
As in, the people on the street would be very earnest with you.
Right, and we all start to talk with the performers and with the public how, like, you trust a stranger more than you trust these voices in the media. So it was so then I realized it's time to go back to the piece that's about lying. And by the time I did it in the new museum, everyone understood what that piece was about, even though that was never its original intention. Even to the point where in that piece, I very deliberately say, or the performers, that your truth can't be longer than 128 characters. So when you tell a lie, they count the characters to make sure that you don't exceed the size of a lie. I don't know if that answers your question, but just in working in public, I've seen in a really short period of time our relationship to truth and promising and facts change dramatically.
Well, it is. I don't know if my question is answerable, but it is sort of about. And it sounds like there is a kind of a shift for you about like, you know, you're talking about stories and public trust and so on, and these strategies have been around for a while, but it is a moment of shifting the way people think about these things. Jill, I know you specifically note to me was like, I don't want to talk about parafiction, which my work is in parafiction, which is the word for people don't know for, you know, fabulated histories, invented histories, invented stories, and so on. And I thought it was really interesting. I was wondering if that was responding to some of the same concerns.
It's such a complicated question because it's really interesting to hear the way that Paul's working, and I think everyone's working in different ways, so that the answer to the question, when I'm thinking about society in general and what's happening with, you know, trust and faith and all of that, I have very strong feelings that I'm obviously working through because it's happening so fast. But in my own work, I would never call my work parafiction because I'm not interested in fabricating histories. And I think a lot of times people ask me about my work, well, is it fiction? And I'm always jealous of fiction writers because I feel like it would be much more efficient if I could just make all this stuff up, because it takes a really long time to make the work that I do. But I'm genuinely really interested in understanding how systems that are veiled or inaccessible or clouded, how they actually work. And I trust myself, so I use myself and put myself in those situations to experience them firsthand in the way I make work and I write about them. Obviously, they're going through me and they're through my experience, and I have ways of seeing things, but I don't think that's fiction or making fables or making myths. So, but that isn't to say that I think that's also an interesting way of working.
But do you find it's harder though? I mean, I do think that your work, like if that's not actually a ring made out of that architect's body, then there is, but that's also very fantastic thing. So I guess, where does the truth effect come from? How do you, do you find people are suspicious? I assume you do, because you were a bit, you specifically wanted to head off that.
Well, for me, it's just really important that things play out in the real and that I follow them. It's just an important part for me. But the first time that it happened, that I was giving a talk, I actually think it was, now it's funny, it was in Texas. I was giving a talk in Fort Worth at the museum there, and I was presenting my work, Evidence Locker, which is a piece I did in 2004 where I'm followed by the police surveillance system, and it's all caught on video. And someone stood up in the audience, and he just says, "I don't believe you." And I was like, you don't have to believe me. It happens to be on public record, you know. So I can't like make people believe me, but I know that it really happened. And for me, that's important, because how am I going to understand how these systems work if I'm making it up? So it's not about as much proving as it is that I just wouldn't know how to make the work. If, I mean, I really have found for myself when people, you know, make the joke, oh, you can't write this stuff, you know, or nonfiction is stranger than fiction, like I have certainly found that to be true in my own life. So I find it more interesting to play it out and see how the system unfolds and represent that through art and writing.
Lauren, I think your work is really interesting on this score because you go back and forth. Like the work about the imagery of Africa is kind of about how we have a fake history or fake images, fake image gallery. But then you're also doing like actual research and fighting it out in the public sphere for these things. So how do you navigate some of the questions about, you know, credibility, getting people to believe?
Well, my background is coming out of a sort of Hollywood filmmaking tradition. So that's where sort of art begins for me. So the idea of the construction of truth is already part of a practice and engagement. And I say that, you know, originally when I was creating more experimental documentary ethnography, I took the term ethnofiction from Jean Rouch as a way of practice, which is going into records and acknowledging the fiction and the construction of truth. So for me, there's sort of two ways of practicing, which is the studio practice and the public practice. The portrait of the African shore was really me looking at, so this is an ongoing archive, but right now there's over 150 clips. Every 2 years it gets updated. So as I see films that claim to portrait the African shore, I rip those things and put it into this sort of video portrait, utilizing sort of the moving horizon. And it's really a way to sort of document how different parts of the world stake claims on this mythology of Africa. So it's constructing, or it's exposing sort of that construction. Versus sort of the public work, the intention with that really is to intervene on the record, to engage what the public record is, to revise, correct, and represent. So sort of primary sources become really important, but also what you find in those records and then comparing them to what sort of the public record is. So for instance, the civil rights movement. Me being a child, I call it post Eyes on the Prize, because I was 7 years old when that film came out on PBS and saw it. And so sort of being conditioned to think of the civil rights movement in a certain type of way, which is usually like the struggle with like, spirituals like underlining the soundtrack. And then actually in doing the work of the Fountain Project and going into primary source material, news feeds, et cetera, seeing kind of a different reality, which is not the downtrodden black person singing, spirituals. There's actually pretty fiery moments on record that didn't make it into the sort of historiography of the civil rights movement. So for me, then the conflict comes in, well, what is my responsibility in actually like undermining those strategies that sort of created there was a reason that the civil rights movement was imaged in that way. Do I undermine it? or do I, sort of respect it and then try to, maybe insert something else there to think about? So I haven't solved that conflict, actually.
But it sounds like it's a little bit of a venue, though, for you. Like that there's the public stuff does have to
has a responsibility.
Has a little bit more of a has to stick closer to the I'm telling you the facts.
Well, there's multiple facts, so it's choosing choosing which facts to show. So for instance, with the drinking fountain, as I'm going through multiple archives and newsreel, I came across this moment, so two moments. The first moment, so both of them during the Birmingham campaign, where what we tend to see are the images of the firemen attacking protesters with hoses. But I found this one little moment where literally there was a man doing like the Watusi in the middle of a fireman trying to map him, and he was literally he was doing the Watusi, and that never made it into Eyes on the Prize, with an underscore of a spiritual, Yeah,
I mean, people may not even believe it.
Yeah.
Might even undercut having that narrative in your, the stereotyped imagery of it.
The narrative or the strategy of nonviolence was to show the monstrosity of white supremacy. And so in a very brilliant strategy, the idea is to put forth images that show extreme passiveness, or not passiveness, but extreme sort of I'll just say non-aggressive gesture to highlight the extremely aggressive and violent gesture. So, when you see a clip of a man cussing somebody out or doing the Watusi, or for instance, the famous image of the 17-year-old who was attacked by the police with the dog, he was actually taunting the dog, and the policeman was actually holding the dog and trying to separate them. Excuse me. So I have to question in terms of my politics is okay, I found this information. People like Malcolm Gladwell were sort of inserting it into public record, too much, sort of conflict and controversy, and in making public work that's supposed to speak, to open up, narratives that haven't necessarily been addressed. What's my responsibility to represent the desires of a certain public that constantly has their voice subverted? So I have an issue in that conflict, and I haven't figured it out yet.
Mm-hmm. Alfredo, do you have any thoughts about how you navigate just the idea of the truth, and whether it's changed?
Well, I've always thought that artists cannot represent reality. We can't. What we do, we represent and create a new reality. So it's never real. It's a representation of the real that becomes a new reality. What we do, in a way, is we create models of looking at the world, or, in my case, ideally, models of thinking the world. So it's really, we are superimposing a model on top of an existing model. So the truth is there, and we represent it, and by doing so, we create a new reality, which is in the intellectual world. Right. And this is our freedom, and this is our right. But of course, when we see this happening with politicians, then it's another story.
Well, yeah, but that's my question: isn't there a kind of reckoning with yeah, I think that for a long time, the kind of intellectual common sense was almost like, yeah, reality is what you make it. Like we're all storytellers, and the regressive thing is to say no, there's this one story, because people have used that idea of there being one story in really repressive ways. And I mean, I don't know if I believe this, but I think people have been talking a lot about this idea that maybe we need to think about how we talk about ideas of the truth and storytelling, and root them in the in a sense of public accountability.
Can I say something?
Yes, you may.
Because I think your question is sort of like a bomb, and this has exploded in my head, which is that collectively, all cultural workers, scholars for, I don't know, 5, 6 decades, we've been working, like, there was a master narrative. I remember growing up with, like, encyclopedias called, like, 50 famous men in history or something like that. And then very collectively, everyone's been working. It's like, look, my history is different. You know, this was left out. And we start to create and fight for an idea that there's a plurality of voices, that some voices are repressed, that some histories are hidden. And I would say we won, like that camp, that cultural camp. But the repercussion is that that right, it's not anti-factual, but now we're in a funny moment. We're like, well, what happens when suddenly you've totally decentered the story? And the people that, or the power that used the master narrative to control now also has that same tool to decenter the story, to decenter facts. And in a way, it's what we collectively, cultural people, intellectuals, have created. And now it's out there in the public domain, and it's being used by people with different sense of ethics. How do you respond to that, right? So I see it on TV all the time. Like, what happens when there's a fact, and then 8 hours later, someone says, no, that was not a fact.
Jill?
I'm going to leave it there, yes.
Well, I mean, I think we're all working through it, you know, but I think that, that we have to be careful about this dialectic where it seems like truth or not true. And, you know, maybe what I understood, Alfredo, what you were saying is, you know, what is the intention? So I feel as artists, and I don't want to speak for all artists, but, you know, at least what I expect from art is that I'm trying to ask questions, right? That the artwork is a way to pose questions. I totally agree with what you said, Alfredo, that it's like by putting something out there, you're positing a way of seeing or a model or a different way of asking questions, and you're putting it in a form that might be absurd. It might seem absurd, like if you wanted to ask the question, why didn't you just ask it directly? Because if you ask a question always directly, you often get the same answers. But if you come at it from different angles, sometimes you can explode it in little ways and rethink things. But I think that when you brought up, like, well, if a politician does it, it is different because politicians, even like when we look at Parkland, which obviously we all know it just happened with the shooting, and this heightened frustration of, like, we want something done now, like it's been too long. There's a difference between making something where you're asking questions and a time when it's like, okay, we need something concrete here. And there's different strategies around that. So it can be complicated to expect from an artist, from a politician, from a historian, always the same kind of way of approaching truth, which doesn't mean fabrication. It's just like a different way of coming at understanding something so that action potentially can be taken or that thinking can happen.
And also maybe, I love what you were saying about those photographs, which is that it made me think the difference between something factual and something truthful, right? It's that facts are so reassuring, but I don't know they're the same thing as truth.
Yeah, interesting.
I was going to say, I mean, to me, the question isn't so much about truth. It's about the record that has power to, you know, sort of push itself onto.
In that sense, that it connects your two threads of works in a way.
Right.
Like, here's the record.
Exists,
and here's the record as we want to
if there's multiple perspectives that have some sort of seed or kernel of truth, how do we create a record that reflects that plurality? And so when, you know, we get into, like, sort of the co-optation then of the, like, project of, you know, creating sort of a plurality of voices. So we have, you know, identity politics being under fire, or the alt-right. That's a co-optation of a project that there was a different intention for. And I hesitate to throw the project away just because, you know, another sort of camp has gotten smart in how to, like, co-opt the work that has been done.
Well, I think that leads into another question that I have, which is then about audience, because to me, maybe that's where the rubber meets the road. It's not so much, because what you were saying about, there are different kind of venues of address. There's like the political arena, there's the artistic arena, and I do think that they have different levels of accountability and different things you can get away with and different buttons you could push and different capacities and so on. And one of the interesting things about all of you is that you work between the public and, art is a public sphere, but there's an art-specific sphere, and then there's the public art sphere, which is a different game and has different stakes and a different conversation when just any old person can, it's a less self-selecting kind of group. I think that does change like some of these things. So I guess I want to ask all of you about audience, or audiences. Who do you make your work for, and how does it change the way you think about these kind of questions we've been talking about?
Well, I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the public and what is a public and how many publics are there. And the way I think of a public work now is that the work is always the work when it is encountering someone else. So, for example, I made a piece in New York called Key to the City, and I thought the 260 people who collaborated were a public, and the public had a form for them and had a very separate meaning. That it's not a totality, like the work of art cannot mean the same for everyone. So those 240 people who worked on the back end, they were a public being addressed by the work, and it made meaning for them. And then there was a front end of the work of people participating. It had a totally different meaning for them. That different, and then because the work often included two people doing something together, that was a secret. I don't even know what happened there. That's another thing. So how can a work of art from all the sides, ideally for me it would be like you go to Home Depot to get the plywood for the piece, and it happens there too. That's too idealistic, but that there isn't one public, right? Each public is public specific, and the work should be addressed that person.
I guess maybe, so to clarify my question, it's a roaring silence on this panel about this audience question, but I guess, one of the things I have a question about this kind of work is like, it does seem like there's, right now, particularly with memorials and monuments, there's this huge discussion about reconsidering what they mean, who they mean it to, and it's a battle that's really defining life in the United States of America at this point. And then there are artists inserting themselves in that conversation, and it's funny for me to kind of navigate when the art sphere is helping this conversation along and when it's kind of containing it. Because these are questions that seem to be, easiest to question where the stakes are the lowest, like in front of an audience that mainly kind of already agrees, that there's a reckoning going on. Whereas these same questions are like completely combustible, out on the streets, where there are huge institutions of civic power and institutional memory and very scary political forces who have attached themselves to very regressive symbols. So it's easy to become very dismissive of the art conversation as kind of a conversation that we're having amongst ourselves about memorialization, because it kind of takes the edge off. But then I think that's too cynical too. So since Pete, you all work between these different spaces, like how do you think of the one conversation connecting to the other? Is the art space where you can model, more better possible ways to approach these things that then can diffuse out? Or is there a more active relationship to those two things? Or is it two kinds of conversations?
Well, in my case, because as an architect, I give myself a program, and within that program, I include, of course, the audience. And I have to ask myself, who am I talking to? And I'm always talking to a very specific audience. We have to get rid of this idea of the universal audience, that the work will be understood by everyone everywhere. No, in my case, I'm really speaking to this specific audience because I'm trying to reach them.
Is that spatial or?
No, it's a physical space, it's a cultural space, it's a political space, it's a social space. I'm directing my program to that specific audience to which I'm trying to address. And so I think it's beyond this idea of audience, it's really a question of communication. What are you doing to communicate to that audience? And something that I always try to remind myself is communication is not to throw a message out there. That's not communication. Communication occurs only when you get an answer.
Right.
That is when communication occurs. That's when you get a real dialogue with the audience. So as an artist, when I'm working on a project, in a specific location, what I try to do is incorporate these elements of communication that are able to reach different audiences. So in my vocabulary, I create entry points to different audiences in that locale, so I can actually engage them in a dialogue. At least that's what I try to do.
I do think that's a strength of the architectural thinking. Like, architects have to think about, look, this is a real, like, infrastructural
That's where
reality.
I'm coming from, so that's how I explain what I do. I don't know how to do it any other way.
But it's interesting to me, you do start, you do ask that question. It's not a universal audience question. I always think of that as the kind of message in a bottle theory of political art. It seems to underlie most of the political art discussion, which is like, there's no relay between like the message. It's just kind of like, I have this thought, I'm putting it in a bottle and I'm gonna put it in the ocean and someday someone's gonna find it. And that's the diffusion of the message in it. And so I do think it's interesting if your methodology is that you start with like, okay, here are the kinds of communities this can reach, and I'm structuring my intervention around those communities.
Yes, and to complete this, I don't like this notion of political art. I think everything we do has a political dimension. There is no way for any one of us to produce anything and put it out of the world that does not contain a conception of the world. So let's forget about this. All art is political, one way or another, even if some artists are not even aware of that. So everything contains a conception of the world. And so we have to be aware of that, and then we have to create the tools for this to be communicated properly to the audience.
But I think it's also like, and I know it's a question I ask myself all the time that often drives a lot of the projects, is maybe it's a question of what is meaningful, you know? Because I don't start a project thinking about who's my audience and
your work is very like migratory, really.
Well, I mean, there comes a point when I do. Sometimes it's as mundane as I have a show here in this country, in this space, and I think about how does it make sense there, or what does it relate, or sometimes I think all of us have a little bit of the architecture history within us, because we're often now in the art world invited to a different country, a biennial, to respond to that city. So oftentimes that's what inspires my work, is that I go to a specific city, I do research on that city, and then it leads to something like that. But a question of like, is what I'm doing meaningful, or does it stay in a small little art world and everybody has the same tools or similar tools to talk about the work, or is it penetrating out in the world? And I think, you know, I question that all the time, and even within the work, though. So, for instance, I made a piece in 2007 called Lincoln Ocean Victoretti, and it stands for love in New York City police radio telephony language. And the whole premise of the piece was I had moved back from Amsterdam, I was living in New York, and it was post 9/11, surveillance had changed, and I started noticing the cops standing on the subway platforms that they were like the new surveillance cameras. They just stood there for 12 hours and they had to watch for terrorists. And to make a long story short, I had one of them train me to be one of these cops that watched for terrorists. And I said, I'll trade you. I'll teach you about art, and you can teach me how to be a cop. And he was like, yeah, well, what I do is important, and what you do is stupid, you know? And, you know, and so, and the whole book, if you read it and all the artworks, like, he kept toggling between, well, maybe I actually was a terrorist, because why am I hanging out on this platform with him?
His account of the...
What?
His account of...
Yeah, he just couldn't figure it out. He's like, what, so you're an artist, what do you do? Do you make models of naked people? No. Do you paint? I used to, I don't anymore. Like, I kind of do this, and then I make art about it. And he was like, you know, what is that? So I think, like, and for me, I too, part of me was like, yeah, what is that? You know, does that matter? Is it, you know? And he was also like, you went to MIT for grad school and this is what you do? Like, you know, so, and there's always a part of my brain, like, is it meaningful? You know, but I think that, that at a certain point when it's time to show the work, you have to be cognizant about where you're showing it, who the audience is, how do you communicate that to them, because of course you're showing it and you want to communicate and you want to create a space of dialogue and intersection, and sometimes it stays within the art context, and then sometimes it gets written about and it flies away from you into these other worlds, and then people have to come with you kind of or against you and try to understand what you're doing. So I don't know if that's an answer again, but I think there is something in here that I keep feeling is about meaning. And the gestures of what we're making, and is it meaningful or is it not? You know, it sort of seems to be an underlining. No.
I mean, if I understood your question, the way I understood your question is that there's discourse going on in this country, and there's the art world, and there's different worlds, and there's the public sphere, and there's debates about monuments and what is history, and are we helping or making it worse? Or is the art world a place where it can be discussed and then it trickles down? And I have to say, and I hate to be militant about it, that hands down, there is a healthier, more complex discourse going on outside of the art world than in the art world.
100% agree.
And I find that it's the reverse. It's like I'm making my work out in the larger public sphere, and those ideas have to be brought back into the art world. And it makes sense. The broader public sphere is more diverse in both ethnicity, social class, ideas. The art world is very insular and homogeneous, even intellectually. So I find that the flow is the reverse, is that it's by making work in a larger public that I can encounter a better discourse that then maybe can be brought in to ameliorate the art world. And I would say that's idealistic, actually.
But I would say, so it's the issue of monuments, particularly Confederate monuments that have come up. There has been I think that we do have a specific skill set that we haven't inserted ourselves enough in the conversation, or we haven't been asked to either. I think it goes both ways. I mean, I personally have experience with sort of, you know, the skill set that I can present being sort of people being skeptical about it. So for me, I think
people are skeptical, like that you have a skill set that's
well,
relevant.
yeah. So for instance, I mean, if we talk about here in Dallas, when the issue of Confederate monuments finally, you know, became a big public moment, was this, and there was a commission formed. The majority of people on that commission weren't artists. Artists weren't consulted. And I think that we have a knowledge of the technology, of the power of these symbolic objects, to be able to then put forth ideas of how to actually deal with them. And so because I think sort of we didn't rise to the occasion of actually maybe, and I'm gonna, I don't know, get kind of, okay, let me back up for a second. I consider, so I didn't grow up in this, I'm not from the South. I'm from Missouri, so technically Midwestern, but I grew up in the South. So for me, my practice is really about being a good neighbor. It's a civic sort of duty. I like talking. I'm Southern in that way. I like conversation. So for me, the Home Depot, that's just as important. Mm-hmm. And usually I end up keeping those relationships where I'm like, hey, y'all, it's done. You want to come, and see it. So to me, that's the multiple audiences of the work. So for me, when I say I'm an artist, that's more of a performative act. And so for me, it's me putting on this hat of artist. I become a performer in that, and that's where the work takes place. So wherever it is, bringing it to center then to distill into maybe an object or an occasion where people are invited, that becomes the place that I convene my neighbors. So when I say that, for me, engaging a public is about a civic sort of, duty. I hate that word, but, responsibility. Then the issue of what particular skill sets do we have that are different than, say, the, corporatist that's on the commission or the, school board president. What can we offer to that as part of our civic sort of responsibility to pushing things forward? And so I think that I personally have been sort of dismayed at how, for the most part, we haven't taken up sort of the call to arms to really sort of step out of the space
this is
of the
our conversation. We should be.
Well, step out of the space of the performatives and representing politics and actually be and embody the politic. And, I think this was one occasion where we could have done that. And I think that I haven't seen it necessarily happen.
But I think what's funny about monuments is that's why I love them, is that, are they art? Are they a subset of art? Or are they and they drift in and out. It's almost like when their meaning is not important, then they're definitely art. And then, right? But then and you might even take them out of the public space and put them in a museum. But as long as they're relevant, I don't know. Like I always say, people go.
A lot of them are kind of almost like a bad parody of Duchampian art, in that they're they're bad artistic objects. They're just inserted into an ideological context that makes them really meaningful to people.
What about when they're beautiful objects and they're still problematic? I mean, sort of the issue, the discussion around the Lee Monument here, that did come up actually as a discussion. Is it art? And I'm like, does it really matter? It's the sculpture, But some of the comments about it was, how beautiful the horse was, and I was like, that's a beautiful horse, I felt kind of sad looking at it being taken away, but that's because I'm coming from a perspective where I'm acknowledging sort of aesthetics, the philosophical, all of that. And so to me, it is art. It has a certain technology that's been built over centuries that we can decode for a larger public, and so that the larger public sort of understands why this is such a powerful object that needs to be addressed.
Speaking of the larger public, before I continue on with this very hot and interesting conversation, just to say, we are gonna have a chance for you guys to weigh in a few minutes. So if there are questions that people have on their mind, so get writing those conversation cards. But back to the conversation here. Well, that's what another one of my questions was about artistic skill sets, essentially. And I think that we're talking about documents, monument making, sort of various forms of public engagement. Now, one could do those things not as an artist. One could be an ethnographer or an anthropologist or an architect, full stop. So I'm interested to know from each of you, how do you define this question that you were talking about? There's an artistic skill set that you bring to the table to these larger conversations. What is that skill set?
Well, I'll start. I think that not actually going back to sort of the beginning of the conversation, it's not being tied to truth. Okay. Not being completely necessarily needing to subscribe to this idea of finding the truth and then being open to the multiple truths. and being able to piece it together in a way that can, you know, affect people on different sort of levels. I think that is a skill set, particularly of artists versus, say, a historian who has a different, or, you know, a traditional historian that works with a very specific protocol that says that you can't make inference, you know, or...
So because art is like useless, essentially, or it's a space where you can, it's kind of a lint trap for all of the things that get shaved off the rest of the disciplines, and it's amorphous. That itself is that space that it opens up is the space, is what people can.
I mean, I think that we have a facility and flexibility to wear multiple hats, and that's a positive thing. So in a day, you can be a professional coddler, a tax accountant, you know, this or that, and you sort of like pick up little things and sort of distill it. And so I think in that way, versus having sort of you know, a singular focus from a particular discipline that looks at the world in one specific way and being tied because of the professional organization that you're signed up to to, like, you know, sort of replicate in that way. I think that flexibility allows us that. And then, of course, the ability to, you know, really have a knowledge of the history of how sort of the technology and the aesthetic of symbolic objects and its impact in culture, being the keepers of that history, right, is also our tools, or part of our tool set.
You guys agree?
It's okay.
No, I think there's parts of it, but I still feel like it keeps going. There's this need to define, okay, like art is, you know, the scrappy things around that don't. I mean, first of all, I think that there's a lot of historians, ethnographers, philosophers that are not like working in one specific way and are trying many different ways. There's even a part of law now that's called feminist law, has been for a while, small, but that looks at the law, for instance, from a feminist point of view in terms of like why are our laws reflecting like white men in power throughout history. Like even the legal system that we're using is based on ideologies that also require questioning. So that's why I think it's just dangerous to be like what's truth, what's fact, what's a different way of coming around, because even things that we think are stable, like law, which is a big part of the work that I'm doing, is questioning like, well, why is the law like that? And it's the ethical questions that, at least of the works that I know here for sure, are bringing up, that I just read in a wonderful quote. I think her name's Kelly Oliver, but I could be saying it wrong, but she said, ethics is what keeps you up at night. Ethics is the restlessness that keeps you going, where everything we're talking about now is like important questions, like are we adding, or which I don't even like saying, are we adding this or we adding that? Like if you're making a work, are you helping make sense of the world, or are you just making it so that everything becomes more complicated and you don't know what's truth and what's reality? And if that is true, then maybe it's good to have to constantly rebuild things, you know, that things we think are stable are not stable, you know, and that happens in science too, you know. It happens in all of these things that we want to stay solid because it's more comfortable. But sometimes art is problematic, and sometimes the politics are messy, and sometimes the questions of ethics do keep you up, but that's important, I think.
Well, I guess I tend to think that one needs at least some sort of working definition of what art, quote unquote, can bring to the table. Otherwise, you end up duplicating effort. And this happens a lot with social practice art. It happens a lot with art that's, quote unquote, technology art, where like people present stuff that's like, this is like the cutting edge, like a cutting edge digital animation film, and you bring in someone who knows, like, has a thing about digital animation, and they're like, yeah, that was like what I did my first year of undergraduate. And so I do think that that there's a great strength to the kind of fluid, multi-discursal thing, but it can also be a little bit like you end up like everyone agrees that what artists are doing is really important, so whatever artists do is important, and then you skip the question of yeah, but have they really done the research?
Yeah,
but I don't think any of us
I don't agree that.
Yeah,
I actually don't agree that art, what you just said. And that's the question that keeps me up, is what is the value? But I do think that it's the space of flexibility and critical questioning that allows at least a little bit of pushing and opening up. And I do think a lot of things get incubated in art that then filter out into the broader sphere. If I think about Project Row House as sort of a blueprint, right? It's not meant to solve the things that people now want it to solve. It was a blueprint that now can be taken by an activist project, by this, by that. And so, but, there has to be a commitment to the things that, sort of the research, sort of the things that you're engaging. You may not go for a master's in this or that, but there has to be a commitment to knowing what those fields that you're engaging are, And I think that's where sort of responsibility comes in. And the work that then seeds itself as something important publicly is because artists do that, choose to do that.
Do you two consider yourselves specialists, or, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, specialists. What do we bring? Well, I have two ideas of what.
All right, what are you doing?
What do we do? One is one is what Bertolt Brecht says that is sort of like my mantra, which is you should just describe the world, the present world to present people, in the form of movable parts. So it doesn't have that rigidity. So it's like I'm describing the world, but see, you can do this. You don't do it, the artist. You just describe it to present-day people as made up of movable parts. So it has the potential for transformation. The other one is...
It's a little bit like her. Definitely.
Yeah, and the other one is I'm a big fan of Apadurai, is instead of thinking about art, just think about imagination. Imagination is one of the biggest things shaping the world. And we ought to be, as artists, specialists in imagination. We should have good imagination. We should... have good imagination muscles, because this is one of the most powerful things in the world, and it should be our medium. I think when you describe that situation of I did this with technology, it's oh, that was done, maybe that work lacked imagination. And I don't mean inventive, but how ideas can shape the world. I don't know if that was clear, but yeah.
I thought it was good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not in general interested in the technical or the manual. I'm interested in the thinking process. And I've always said that for me, art is 99% thinking and 1% making. So for example, when I teach, I ask my students to please stop making stuff, because schools forces them, ask them to make things and to produce things all the time. And the first thing I say is, please stop. Please stop. And let's start a conversation. All the works that you have shown of mine have taken between 3 and 5 years. And it's a long research process. And the thing we do is thinking and thinking and thinking. And only at the end of this long process, when I reach that point of critical information that I think I understand where I am, I understand what is my context, I understand who is my audience, I understand what I'm trying to do, then perhaps I can articulate all this thinking into something concrete. And then that little 1% is the final result that you see, that everyone sees. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Behind that, it's just a long process of thinking. So I believe this is the skill that we can bring to the table, the thinking process and intellectual and critical thinking with, of course, the component, the ethical component.
So would you say, the question of, what does an artist or art bring to the table on top of all the other things it's drawing on, is that a certain kind of critical thinking, a certain kind of way of recombining different elements.
And creating models of thinking the world.
But different than I don't know, philosophy.
No.
It's like a subset, or
I mean, I've talked to artists and philosophers, and I've realized that they're very close. They're extremely close, because it's a way of looking at the world.
You guys agree? You're all philosophers.
I think that that there's also ways of like, while you're making things is a form of thinking. Like, I don't think thinking just has to be like only in your head and you sit there and you're not making things. There's different ways. Sometimes you have the idea and you make it, but I find that the thing then you made never looks exactly like you thought it was going to be. And that's where that's the joy, right? Is that you step back and you're like, did I do that? But making is also a way of thinking, and and then putting it out there in the world sometimes while it's being formed is different than when you put it out there and then you could look at your work 10 years later and you look back and it means something else, or you understand, oh, I made that because politically these things were happening, or socially these things were happening. So it's hard to like know exactly what it is while you're doing it, and I don't mean that in a floaty kind of way. I think that it's a kind of interrogative process, and that's where I would agree that it is like a philosophy, it is like a lens, it is a way of seeing, and I don't think it has anything to do with if you're using the latest technologies or not. You can use the latest technology in an awesome, fantastic way that makes you think through something, or you can use the latest technology that's like fetishistic about that technology. So that's just a medium. Yeah.
I'm going to super respectfully disagree with Alfredo. Because I think what makes Alfredo's work great is that form is everything. That last 1% might be small, but it actually outweighs the 99% because it's the old mind-body project. We are in our bodies. We are bodies and ideas. And those ideas, when they become form, when they become embodied, then there is both an emotive and intellectual response to what you're thinking. And I think it's that moment where the ideas become form that is the powerful moment. So I think it's not just thinking. I think it's really that transition from idea into action. That's why I think the Appareil is so interesting, talking about imagination that's even larger than art, larger than culture. It's like, it's similar to like someone's in Guatemala and they're like, I think it's way better over there. And they walk 6,000 miles to get here and to get a job and a better life. It's like an idea became form and action. And I think that it's that moment when art can be amazing. And it's very similar to the way that imagination becomes action in the world for people who are not artists.
So form making.
Form making.
It's like actually very classical definition of the artist, but in this kind of post-classical world where there's not necessarily a medium, like a paint or sculpture that you have to make form with. Like the artist is the kind of conductor of this shape-shifting process that you talked about, plus the final form.
I mean, it's clear. I mean, as you have shown our works, they all look coming from so many different disciplines. If we look again at the works you have selected from us, they obviously seem to be coming from so many different disciplines. So I think what's nice is that there is a sense of freedom. And it's really, of course, ideas have been expressed in different mediums according to the needs of those ideas being expressed.
So if there are questions, I'm going to ask you guys another question, but while that question is being answered, if maybe I can get to some of the questions from the floor. Okay. So I guess coming here towards the last quarter of our conversation together, we go back to really where we maybe should have started, which is this is a conversation about documents and monuments. Why documents? You know, what is it? We're talking about that that there's not a specific medium that you work in. You sort of work in public spaces as your medium in a certain sense, or work with institutional structures as your medium, or work with documents as your medium. So why documents to begin with? Like, what is that? This is not necessarily for any of you. It's specifically not the fantastic that you're interested in. There's this grounding in facts or truth or whatever we want to call it that the document provides.
When did your obsession with documents begin?
Well, I think.
And what does it enable you to do?
Sorry?
And what does it enable you to do, I guess?
You know, I hadn't thought of, well, when I started using documents, it went hand in hand with trying to understand the system I was entering or exploring, right? So if I take, for example, the surveillance system of Liverpool, how I brought up, I read everything I could on that system to understand how it works, in the same way Alfredo is saying that he tries to understand a site. That's a site too. An institution's a site. How can you understand it? One way is by reading everything that they've produced, right? That describe how the system works, how you access it, how you don't. I found that the documents, like the police forms and the legal forms, describe the system in this really bureaucratic way that helped me understand the system and also the loopholes into the system, so a point of entry. So in that document, to get access from the CCTV cameras, you had to say who you were, the time of day, the incident that happened, and send a picture and 10 pounds, and the police have to find you, right? That's what the document says. But the bureaucratic structure of it has a lot of poetic space, right? A lot of room, because it's so strict that there's a lot of ways of trying to undercut through it and see holes in it of how to enter it and participate in it. So I would say that the document sometimes is a kind of map of understanding how a structure is intended to work and the potentials of maybe seeing it work in another way. But a document inside of an archive is also like a collected history of something. And but there's also a lot of rooms, like Lauren, I was thinking how you said that one, maybe I misunderstood it, but the video of the dog, and that in certain instances it looked like that one thing was happening, but if you played it a little bit longer, it turned out something completely other was happening. And so documents are porous in that way too, and it's not that it's truth or lie, it's just that if you look at it longer or you contextualize it differently, it has a different meaning. So I think that those things are either really informative, they're always informative, but the information they can give is very wide, depending on who's looking, how hard they're looking, how long they're looking, what order they're looking. So it's very rich space to enter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have a smart answer. For me, it's super emotional. It's like, I think the first archive I worked with I was 23, and I wanted the NASA audio archives of the Apollo 11 mission. Because, you know, the astronauts were on the moon, and they were recording everything, and they had constant radio contact. And I'm such a nerd, it's like I had to get it, and the Smithsonian only had excerpts, and I had to contact the NASA librarian, and there had been budget cuts at the time. There was only one librarian left, you know, so like, I paid them extra to make me copies of the tapes during shuttle missions, and then I listened 23 hours of Men on the Moon. 8 hours are static, they're sleeping. I don't know what it is, but there's something so beautiful and moving in there. But the archive is really boring, right? So it's like, the archive is super boring. There's nothing more boring than going to see a show, and it's like an archive. So it's like, it's this tension for me as an artist. It's like, I love it so much. I find it so moving, formally, so boring. Like, and then just trying to I don't know, I don't even have words. Like, you want to make it mean for other people what it means to you. And yeah, that's why I work with documents.
Mm-hmm.
Any other musings on documents? Well, okay. So let's let the public speak through me. So this is a question for all of you. All of the panelists work to define, amplify, reflect, or interrupt structures or systems. Wouldn't you say your work accepts those structures as a starting place, and by doing so accepts their reality? Isn't that their difference from alternative facts?
Accepts their...
Maybe it might actually be a rhetorical question, but they're saying the idea of the alternative facts is sort of just a questioning of reality as if there is no reality. And basically, I think they're hypothesizing that you all do not function within that frame, that there's like, we all have our own truths, we all have our own facts, that you all start with the idea that there is a reality or there is a structure that you're questioning. And maybe that's a way to think about what you're doing as different and not fall into the kind of, oh, are we just feeding the fragmentation of the public conversation?
I mean, for me personally, there's a structure that has material consequence, and so.
Which one are you talking about?
That's
which work are you talking about?
Oh, I'm saying in general, in general, and the work, my work comes from trying to just sort of sift my way through things, but. I guess I'm still a little bit hesitant in this sort of conflating, or what do we empower this this alt-right to do? I mean, alternative fact is not dealing necessarily in any sort of form of fact, or we're we all have our own truths. Sure, but like, how does that relate to the structures that we're talking about?
Right.
And if we can't come into consensus about actually examining the structure, then whatever, go write your story. But I don't feel like we're in the same sort of conversation or world. So I think that I think structure has material consequence, and I think that there's many ways to try to understand and pull apart and create sort of broader records and things like that. I don't know if that really answers the question, though.
Close enough for horseshoes. This is for you, Paul. You say the art world needs to take in, but although I'll take an answer from anybody. You say the art world needs to take in more ideas. Do you feel you are thriving more in this currently a chaotic society, or is it too polarizing?
Oh. What was the first part? If the art world needs to...
You say the art world. You say the art world needs to take in more ideas. Do you feel you are thriving more in this currently chaotic society, or is it too polarizing? So we were talking about the insularity of the art world before, and you were talking about the need to, the need for more intellectual diversity, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's maybe it's too insular, but I just think the art world has been. The art world is an industry, and it's in a great moment of consolidation. And what that does is that the ecosystem is getting, it used to be that we used to eat a lot of animals, and now we eat chicken, sheep, cow, and we used to eat like 50 kinds of mammals. And I think it's happening to the art world. It's like the discourse is actually becoming really small. It's not so much that the outside world is becoming chaotic, is that due to forces that are bigger than any of us, mostly commercial, and also what's happened to publication is like the discourse of art is becoming really small and impoverished. So it's not so much that I think the world out there is chaotic and I'm flourishing in it, it's just richer. And I don't even think it got richer. Well, I actually don't know. I have the problem, like I'm in my perspective and I can't see outside of it. I don't know if the artwork got poorer and the world at large is the same it's ever been, or the world at large got so much more richer that in comparison the art world seems really impoverished. But I think, I don't know what the question was, but yes, the art world could benefit from letting in ideas from the outside.
Well, this is just me injecting my own perspective as a writer, which is that I guess what you just said does make me realize that one of my underlying questions about the documentary turn or the turn towards documents or these kind of bigger projects what Jill does is the world of art discourse has shrunk a lot. You know, it's just there's less of it on a professional level every day, and I do think on some level. One sense of there even being something called an art world is like a sense of having it being written about and reflected and being connected to the world through like its coverage, and that's true in New York, and it's much more true outside of New York, where it's like art worlds are much smaller and fighting for their space in much more noble way in a lot of ways. But so I do just have this question in the back of my mind is whether or not there is some sense that artists are kind of like, I'm going to tell my own stories, I'm going to just like create a discourse that through these documents, it plugs into a conversation that already exists, people are having outside of the art world, because the art world itself is just kind of like its own stories are kind of shriveling away. I don't know if that makes sense, but I do have that question. I think there is this turn towards kind of artists becoming their own publishers, artists like creating their own universes, little art worlds, and I think that's partly because of this tremendous shrinking of the conversation. And I'll leave you to think about that. What parts of it is for all of you, including me, what parts of your practice are you willing to give up or change to deal with the Trump era? Do you have faith in the art world that it can rise to the occasion?
Which art world are we talking about?
I like to use the word art, nation, states. And so, we can decide which nation state we're talking about, the really powerful one or, in other locales. I think, so what are you willing to give up in the Trump era? I don't know if I'm going to loosely tie it to this, but I do think, so there's, a scholar, activist, Stephen Duncombe, that has this idea of ethical spectacle, which I didn't realize that I was doing ethical spectacle until an activist friend of mine said, look at this YouTube video at minute 22, and apparently, like, he was lecturing and putting my work in context with his theory in, like, the Netherlands or something. And so, but the thing is, that did kind of give me a little bit of a new, like having someone else locate my identity in that sphere, it did sort of give me a boost or a clarity of vision. So for me, I think that it's not a matter of giving up, but it's more about like becoming committed. And that's sort of what I may be like conflicted about a little bit, is that, the idea of ethical spectacle is that the left can utilize our ability, particularly creatives can utilize the ability to create spectacle in a way that the right has a facility of, but the left, because of ethical reasons, has a problem with like engaging in those terms. And so I think it's an interesting premise, but again, it goes to this call of like civic duty, right? That is part of your practice, but also how do you lend your practice to a larger project? And so for me, personally, giving up something in the Trump era is actually like, no, I need to keep my sanity. I find myself getting more direct in a way that I didn't before. I'm getting called social justice warrior, and I'm like, I'm not even that, really. I mean, I really don't commit to anything, but okay, using Pomo language, all of that sort of stuff. And actually find like those sort of accusations to be empowering, because I feel like there needs to be a certain like clarity in this moment to sort of, act in certain ways.
I feel that the new reality in which we live is so overwhelming that we cannot give up anything.
Yeah.
And on the contrary, we just have to keep working on creating new models. So this new reality that we are facing requires new models. And so far, I haven't seen them, and I don't think they have been created yet.
Yeah. New reality, though. Yeah. Because for me, it's not that new. And maybe that's why there's difficulty with questions for me. In this particular part of the country, I had multiple conversations with friends on the coast, and I could not access sort of the surprise of what this moment is. I couldn't access it because where I am in this part of the country, particularly in certain circles, this is just history doing its pendulum swing. And we can start, if we're studying history, we can start to predict what's happening. So I'm not so sure about new realities, or as much as it is about
present reality.
Yeah, it's after the election. I teach at a very large graduate program, and the students were in New York City, so it's a very liberal city. So after the election, the students were depressed. And I remember making like a little drawing and a slide. We were trying to give them a pep talk, and mine was really depressing because I was just telling them, well, what's really different this morning than that was not true yesterday? It's like we're citizens. A good portion is incarcerated. Another huge portion is undocumented. Another large portion is indebted, and then everyone is surveilled. Those are really the problems we have. All those problems didn't get worse, and they didn't happen last night. It's like they happen with, they've been as true during Democratic administrations as they've been true during Republican administrations. And I was trying to actually cheer them up. But yeah, for me, it's just like I made a commitment to working in a larger public sphere, and this slight change, or at least it becomes more visible, it's just a recommitment to doing that, not stopping or changing it.
I gave my students the same talk, and for me, the clarity of vision is actually what's potentially slightly different.
Yeah, it's like
things
sharp
are coming
focus.
into focus.
Yeah.
Then you can decide how you're going to then engage with what you're seeing, and that to me is actually like what potentially is, if there is something good, it's potentially that.
As you asked.
I didn't ask that.
Yeah, I wouldn't know what to give up as much as to follow. I mean, I read as much as I can to see what's happening, but I have noticed also in teaching a kind of angst aggressiveness with my students. I teach at Cooper, and in a way that I hadn't seen before. Like, for instance, when a student's presenting a work that doesn't seem to have issues, certain ethical issues or something will like suddenly rear its head that it's about those things, when half the students you can see are like uncomfortable. What is it? What I'm trying to say is that there seems to be like a real urgency and confusion of like how to behave right now in the art schools. And I don't know if you guys see it, but friends of mine in different schools have said the same thing. And I think that what I've learned with my students is sometimes what the argument or the critique becomes about isn't really what the questions are. what they're coming from, and I find that right now things are so overwhelming, and there is this kind of feeling of helplessness, that it comes out in weird ways, and I think that speaking about it and trying to calm everyone down, that's been the first thing, is like some of the critiques get like aggressive in a way that I haven't seen before, about politics, race relations, religion, like Israel-Palestine, like real, like vicious kind of debates. And so my whole thing has been with them, like, okay, let's calm down and try to talk things through. And a lot of times it becomes not about the artwork. Later, maybe that comes in, but that is something I have noticed, is this kind of like energy and frustration. So I would say that gentleness and like trying to understand and unpack things and maybe go a little slower and more committed is an answer. And it sounds kind of fluffy when I say it out like that, but it has proven to be kind of a real thing that I've been experiencing over the last year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I don't not believe the question is really for me, but I will say that, yeah, it's a real complex one, because to me, it's just the way the conversation has played out in the last year and a half has made me realize two completely opposed things, which is, one, there is a sense of complacency about, like, we have rooms where we could talk really openly like this, and, you know, we could have artistic conversations you kind of know, more or less, like, you know, that there's a level of taking for granted this sort of freedoms that art represents, that I sort of that threw into relief for me. That some of these things that you thought were kind of, I kind of corrupt entitled spaces, and they still are, you know, like encrusted with all kinds of privileges and umbilically linked to all kinds of weird things. But nevertheless, there's these kinds of spaces in civic society around arts and culture that you can have you could have conversations like the one we're having tonight. And I did feel a little bit like, maybe we've taken that for granted. Like this is not necessarily the case. You know, at Hampshire College, right after the election, tempers were high, and they burned an American flag, and that is something that probably happens every so often on college campus, but that became a huge thing. I mean, like, people were like, there were militias who mobilized on that, gun militias mobilized on that campuses to kind of like intimidate them, and it became a big right-wing media furor, and the entire faculty and campus were being intimidated in crazy kind of ways, you know. So that's on the one hand, that like actually some of the things that I thought were platitudes are actually things that maybe I should re-examine as like, these are some, I want to fight to actualize the values contained with them. And then on the other hand, so quickly, I think, the discourse of political art that you were talking about became so quickly captured by the industry, the spectacle industry, where not just in art, but there's, but by 3 months afterwards, after the election, the next round of art fairs came, and people were writing articles that were like, activism is the hot trend. And it's like, activism is not a trend, actually. That shows you don't know what you're talking about, actually, if you're saying.
Sponsored by Mercedes.
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing, and that's become, the level, the Hall of Mirrors level of the political discussion right now, where you can't know when you're winning or losing, because there's like such a industry of producing critique. It's not a marginal thing. It's like the level of political, it's the mainstream branding of like the Tonight Show. Is that they're part of the resistance. So that produces just a level of diffusion of of critique that I think is a negative thing arts and culture does. And right after the election, what I wrote is like, you know, if you look historically at, I don't know, the experience of Brazil under the dictatorship or something, right after, you know, there was a period between the coup and the crackdown. And during that period, arts and culture had like a huge space to talk. And looking back on it, people, when they reckoned with that space, is like, oh yeah, people were really just amusing themselves where the levers of power consolidated outside. So I guess I have ended up with a double kind of thought, which is that on the one hand, you want to fight for these spaces, on the other hand, what you need to fight for within them is like, look, we need to be looking outside of these spaces. So,
So do you then think that then the question of accountability and to what and to whom, when did those conversations start happening? Because I feel like that's the next step, right? I mean, if that's a goal, to think about art outside of the sphere of representing something, but actually being the thing that it claims to be. Then there becomes a conversation about responsibility to some sort of larger effort, right? And so at what point do you have that within these spaces? What point does that sort of get parsed and then committed to in these spaces? Or does it? Because then
now, right, really, I mean, yesterday.
I mean, because then the conversation becomes, well, then we're taking away autonomy of like radical imagination, that like, you know, sort of like why radical imagination sort of happens is because there is sort of a disconnect from obligation, right?
Yeah, well, that's why I say it's a two-sided thing, because I agree with Alfredo very much that I don't like the category of political art, and in a certain sense, it's like, that's just not, I just don't think it's the best instrument for a lot of the things people want to do with it, you know? And that in some ways it's like, yeah, I mean, this is a vice of lefties all the time, is that they're like, they're unable to talk to people who are interested in things that, you know, who interested in culture on levels other than the kind of most urgent, pressing, burning thing, and that cuts them off from wider layers of people who just aren't there yet with them. And so I do think there's a really positive aspect to keeping that conversation opening. But then, yeah, there's the question of, what do you do? What's happening? It's, you know, like one of these questions said, you know, it's a polarizing, divided, chaotic time, I think was how they put it.
But I think I'm going to do a plug-in because the Nasher is behind this. It's like, and they're about sculpture. And I think that at one point I was saying I work in the sculptural tradition, not a sculptor. And I think like in moments where I'm confused, representation and discussion can be really, and the nice thing about the sculpture, things that come from a sculptural way of thinking, is that they're enactment. There's always some degree of enactment. Simply because it's like an object in the real world or not just an image. So I think that in these times, enactment is really important, that you always have like some percentage of what you do that is not just a symbol or an image or a deliberation, but that there's also needs to be a quotient of enactment in the world, just to keep it real, literally, you know.
Okay, we're almost at the end, but things got really grim here at the end. So I'm going to ask one final question, and you know, then we can all meet and mingle and figure out the ontology of art, the nature of the monument, and the future of the society we live in. Last question. This is to Jill and Lauren, but we'll open to everybody. How do you think / consider the permanence of your work or its place in creating and forming a history of our current time?
Say the question again.
Basically, how do you think about your work in terms of contributing to a bigger question about the history of our current time? That's about permanence, you know, and versus impermanence, and just the contribution that artists are making, you specifically, to writing the history of our time. Yeah.
Well, so I do think, I mean, this is something I play with because I consider myself, like, I consider part of my practice monument making, even though the things I make are not permanent. And so for instance, the fountain, I call that a monument, but it's a temperamental new media piece that, like, you know, I get calls from the county every so often that says, it's not working, somebody's pushed the button to, you know. So, and then actually now, because the building, which is right across the street, is under reconstruction for 5 years, it's completely gutted. The piece is like gone, you know? And so this thing I've been calling a monument, this thing that I worked on for 10 years to get into the public space is actually not there anymore. And the talks with the county is how to bring it back in this new space when the sculpture was intended to respond site-specifically to the, you know, revealing of the white trace. Thing, yeah. So there's all these discussions of like, okay, we're gonna build a gallery space for it and like bring back the marble, and I'm just like, that actually is not the project, so what happens now? And so this question of monument building, like, and trying to really figure out, because, you know, initially when I proposed the project, it was to sort of like, you know, intervene on this idea of like, we write our memories in stone. And what happens when we use new media. Cinema as a public art form, is a sort of document, you know? But now it's like a temperamental thing that's gone away, you know? So I'm really trying to figure that out. Because I do think when, you know, the zombie apocalypse comes, what's left is the record, and video and things that need electricity may not make it, you know? So, you know, so right now I'm actually currently working on a project with Kimberly Meyer at the Cal State Long Beach University Art Museum, where we're thinking about monument as the thing that enacts the architecture that's there. And so for me, currently I'm doing research that looks at different documents, court records, police transcripts, whatever, to find, and then they're dealing with cases of police violence, to find or to identify the places where there's obvious fabrication. So for me, this came up when, for instance, with Michael Brown's death and Darren Wilson, claiming that Michael Brown said, "You are too much of a pussy to shoot me." When Trayvon Martin was murdered, George Zimmerman claimed that Trayvon Martin, this 17-year-old boy, said, "You're gonna die tonight, motherfucker." Now, so when I heard these things, immediately I was like, well, first of all, like, black kids, like, we don't talk like that. Like, we don't use pussy in this sort of order. We don't use motherfucker at the end. Like, you know, there was something really off about, there was something really off about that utterance, which felt very un-black to me. And so, so I proceeded to take this, identify these lines, and then ask different black men who have facility and performance, whether they're spoken word artists, rappers, theater, you know, whatever, ask them to embody saying these lines. And over a course of hours in studios, like, they could not say it. They wanted to switch words around. They wanted to, like, add things. And I'm like, no, you have to say it like this. And so what was interesting going through the process was that they went to Hollywood's construction of black masculinity to try to say these words. So it was like, Denzel Washington, how would he say it in Training Day? You know? And that's the only way these things started to come out. And so for me, this is like a theory of how how the black body is constructed through white supremacy, the white psyche, and how, like, culture industry is a major part of that construction. And so I took these sessions and I'm putting them onto vinyl, and then I'm presenting them on pedestals. And so for right now, with Cal State, they're going to do an installation of at least 30 in a grid. And this to me is a monument. And the idea is that as these, what does it mean for an institution to become a monument because of what's inside of it? And then what does it mean to be impermanent? And as this travels, it will grow. What does it mean to steward and become a monument? So that's the way I'm starting to think about it. But at the end of the day, when these things are archived or, you know, gone, I mean, for me, working with the record was one way of making it a little bit more permanent. But when it's not activated, it's gone, you know?
Maybe the discourse is the permanent part.
The discourse.
The change that it makes. And
that's one thing I was going to say, and sort of like what I was between Alfredo and the idea of, like, what art being sort of the product of critical thinking. I tend to look at work as a text. We're producing text, which is the remnant of thought that then inspires more thought because of an engagement with it. And so for me, that is our skill set, you know, and it is philosophical. So yeah, I'll stop.
Well, I think one beautiful thing about making anything and putting it out in the world is that you don't know how it's going to move through history or how it will be understood, and sometimes that quickly changes and sometimes it's a long change. When I first started working with surveillance, you know, people thought that Evidence Locker was a site-specific work because that's where surveillance cameras were. And I was like, surveillance cameras are not just in Liverpool. And now that's a banal thing to think. Everyone knows surveillance cameras are everywhere, so people think Evidence Locker took place in London because the book says one cycle of memory in the city of L, but L stands for Liverpool. But it doesn't matter, right? I mean, it can be a lot of different cities, whereas then it seemed very specific to people, you know. And then with the Barragan project, and also with a piece that I did about, the first piece I did about artistic legacy is called Auto Portrait Pending, and it was a piece I made in 2005 that when I die, my body will become a 1-carat diamond placed in right now an empty ring setting, and it is physical and permanent. It's an open ring box with an empty ring setting, and I think totally emotional to see an empty ring setting that's essentially my grave, and documents of what will happen when I die and how that diamond will become set into that ring. And I've always been really interested in artworks that evolve over time, and some of them are controllable, like that work. The next step is when I die, right? But then there's all the complicated questions about the collector who buys that work. How are they implicated in that work that I can't know until that happens? And then with the Spy project, there were some neons on there. When the institution confiscated the work from the Tate Modern, they confiscated documents that were letterpress pieces that described each agent I met, and they're the same language that is in the neon. So the description of the spy is in a letterpress piece, and that same text is the neon on the floor. And they confiscated the text, but they left the neon. And basically there it is, right there. And what you can't see in there very well with the lighting is there's 2 neon pieces there that have been turned off that I unplugged. And so every spy that they confiscated the document, I pulled the plug for that neon, and that's a way of like making tangible and physical this, where somehow to this institution, when it's written on paper, it's threatening, but when it's art on the floor, it's not. And so I don't know how my work will be seen later, but I embrace the fact that it evolves and changes over time, and I like when the work reflects that, and I hope that every time the work is engaged, it will feel meaningful to some people who see it, and that's the way, and that's why I think that archives should be accessible to more people, is because the more you engage with it, the more alive it is. So, yeah.
Well, I think on that note, which is how art might be a way that history lives on in another disguise, I think that's a fine note to end.
Can I make one
conversation? Yeah, of course.
Yes, but the most powerful art nation state, when it doesn't validate all of the sort of things that are happening, then we still have an inadequate record. And so then it's left for people to go out and sift in what's happening in these different, locales. So I do want to say that, yes, there is the idea that like things get left behind in text and discourse and whatever, but there's still sort of a power dynamic that happens. There's still institutions that are sort of replicating, right, the things that make things inequitable. And so there is the chance that like the products or the things that people, that someone like me produces doesn't make it into the record eventually, you know? And so then I still haven't accomplished this task of making a monument about histories that I'm trying to present.
But then an artist 2 generations later
will come and find it.
and re-present it. Then it has a life again.
I think on that note, we should let people stand up. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you to the Nasher.